Hi again, here again at the Australian Army Tank Museum in Puckapunyal, 120 kilometres north of Melbourne, and taking a look at some of the World War II armour that's in the collection, and continuing again with some of the British armour from earlier in the war. So here we have an example of the cruiser tank, the Mark IV cruiser, also known as the Crusader Mark I, which is in the collection. This vehicle was supplied to Australia for trials during World War II, and it was trialled here at Puckapunyal. This is one of the very early versions of the Crusader, and you can see that it still has a turret at the front left position for the Beza machine gun. So rather than having the machine gun mounted in a ball type arrangement, it's actually in a turret. And this was these turrets were removed often in the field because they weren't that effective and they were difficult to use. And they were removed from later marks of the Crusader. So a very interesting example that's preserved here at the museum. So this is a British cruiser tank, which means it's primarily designed to break through enemy front lines, to move rapidly through those lines and start to exploit that breakthrough and engage enemy communications and armoured vehicles behind those enemy lines. So this compares, interestingly, to the infantry tank Churchill, which we looked at just a few minutes ago. So in the British doctrine, these cruiser tanks, these were the ones which were designed for engaging enemy armour primarily, as opposed to the infantry tanks, which were there to support infantry on the move. So this vehicle is an iteration of the cruiser family. It's the fourth cruiser that the British worked on in the lead up to World War II. And this tank was employed after the Battle of France, and primarily in the Desert War in the Western Desert and in North Africa. So about 5,300 Crusaders were produced in total. Many of which, like this one, were produced with the 2-pounder anti-tank gun. So it's a 40mm anti-tank gun, which for the start of the war was quite a potent weapon when you put it up against early iterations of certainly the Italian tanks that had encountered in North Africa, and Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs. As the war in the desert continued, and as German tanks became more heavily armoured and became more heavily armed as well, the tanks started to be overmatched compared to those enemy tanks. So the turret's a riveted construction, so built on a frame that is riveted together, and then the armour plates are riveted to the outside of that. In addition to the 2-pounder anti-tank gun, you can see that it's got the provision for the Beza in the turret, as I already mentioned, as well as another Beza which could be coaxially mounted on the 2-pounder, and that isn't in this example. And you have a small citadel there on the right side of the tank for the driver's position. So there's that citadel, and here's a nice close-up of that turret, which was difficult to see in most examples that are out there in the field. So it had a Christie type suspension. So given that the cruisers were designed for breakthroughs and operation behind enemy lines, they were designed to travel at quite high speeds. The cruiser had this cruiser, the Crusader, had a maximum speed of 42 kilometers per hour on road, using that Christie type suspension. So having a Christie type suspension means that the wheels are mounted on arms that swing, and that there are springs inboard of that side armor plate that control the motion of the wheels. So you can imagine the wheels will pivot on their swing arms, and the spring which is inboard of that plate will control the amount of rotation that you get. As with most British cruiser tanks seen during World War II, you've got a rear-mounted engine and a rear-mounted and a rear drive sprocket. So the drive is at the rear as well as the engine being at the rear, which is similar to the configuration that you saw in T-34s and Soviet tanks. So as the war went on, this vehicle became, as I mentioned, overmatched compared to the German tanks that it was encountering in North Africa. And when it was employed, it was pretty much the only cruiser that the the British had available in any large numbers. As the war in North Africa progressed, it was supplemented in British service with M3 tanks that came on board with their 75mm guns mounted in a sponson, and later on with Shermans, both of which were supplied to the British under Lend-Lease. So the British were able to phase this tank out in favour of that American supplied hardware, and as they got their other cruiser tanks under development back in the UK. So the engine type on this is that you've got a Liberty engine in the back, a British-built version of the US Liberty engine, which was an aero engine originally, and was localised in the UK and built by Nuffield, so a petrol engine. So I think main advantages for this kind of tank with its suspension and the way it was designed was its high speed, good cross-country performance, and also the ability to fire effectively on the move. The vehicle had a poor reputation when it was introduced. A lot of teething issues, a lot of reliability issues in the desert, but these were sorted out as the engines were improved, and it was the backbone of the force that blunted the Italian and later German attacks in North Africa. So at the time had a difficult introduction after the war when compared to some other armour from other countries such as Russia or the US. You could say its reputation wasn't that great, but it was the vehicle that was available to help protect British interests in Egypt and fight the war in North Africa while waiting for Lend-Lease materials to come available. So that's the Crusader Mark I, Cruiser Tank Mark IV in the collection here at the Australian Army Tank Museum.